So what we will initially see is an increase in the cost of a home in Australia, which is great for investors and is great for those who already own homes. But for those trying to get into the market, not so great. Welcome back to Money Media. My name's James, and today we're going to discuss the 5% first home buyers grant and what it means for our property market. So the current government has just came out with a renewed plan. Well, the plan has actually been in place for a little while, but effectively what they were intending to do was to introduce another first home buyers grant into Australia in 2026. But they've recently announced that they're actually going to bring that homeowners grant forward for the 1st of October. And so today in this video, I'm going to run through some of my concerns around this first home buyers grant and what I think will occur in the market, and also some of the risks that it opens up as well, more broadly for Australia and for Australians. So we've covered first home buyers schemes, grants in the past in prior videos, and we've made several videos around our property market and why we currently have more of a policy crisis than a housing shortage crisis. And the reason for that, just briefly, is because our policy in Australia is designed to incentivise people to buy property and hold it for long periods. And so with that, we also lack the incentive in our policy structure to rent homes out, because they generate such strong and powerful growth that, and often with a tenant, may come with its own problems. So a lot of homeowners and investors rather are actually not overly incentivized to rent or lease their property out, which is why a lot of the properties in Australia are left vacant day to day, which is part of the reason that fuels our housing crisis. And so it's hugely, and there are a few other factors, but it's hugely to do with a policy issue and not a housing supply issue. So what the first home buyers grant is going to do is allow people to buy a home with a 5% deposit, which is going to increase the amount of demand for housing. Now, increasing the amount of demand for housing is fine, so long as the supply of housing is increased at the same rate, and then prices theoretically would stay the same. But a few factors tell us that our housing supply won't increase in the short term. Factors such as excessive governmental red tape, factors like high taxation and stamp duty, factors like skills shortages in trades to construct these homes. We've got high building supply costs as well, and the list goes on. So because of all those factors and more, we can safely assume that supply will not keep up with this artificial demand that the current government is creating through this first home buyers scheme. So what we will initially see is an increase in the cost of a home in Australia, which is great for investors and is great for those who already own homes. But for those trying to get into the market, not so great. Now, I want to talk about a couple of concerns that this actual scheme raises for me, and the timing of it as well. It really doesn't sit well. But to understand those concerns, you need to understand some of the detail around this first home buyers grant. So how this is set up is that what the government has done this time, which has previously been different, is for this time they're not going to means test the first home buyers grant, which means your income can be, you could essentially be making $500,000, $800,000 per year and still be eligible for this first home buyers scheme. The second thing is they've also increased the cap on the house pricing, whereas before it was capped relatively low. I believe it was around or below the median house price of Australia, whereas they've actually increased upon that. The other factor to consider with this, and one of the main reasons for concern, is that the government is backing the loan. And what that means is if the lender if the mortgagee, so the person borrowing the money, goes into default on the loan and therefore they cannot pay the loan, then what's going to happen, as happens in all cases, is the bank or the lender would sell that home and recoup their money. But if the value of that home has dropped to the point where the banker sells the home and they haven't recovered all the money that they lent out, then what the government is going to do is give that bank the difference between what the home costs and what it costs them to loan out the money. Now, we all know that the government doesn't have money other than taxation. So what they're actually doing is telling lending institutions that no matter what, no matter who you lend to buy a home, the taxpayer will cover the difference. So they're essentially taking away all the risk from the lender. And so what do you think will happen to lending restrictions? Do you think they'll tighten or do you think they'll loosen? Well, history would tell us that the lending restrictions would loosen because the risk that the lender has to incorporate into their lending has lessened. There's essentially, I won't say no risk, but there's very, very, very low risk of that bank or that lender to lend money, regardless of the financial situation that mortgagee is in. We've seen in the past with similar things happen in the banking sector and in the lending sector that this tends to create macro shocks through the economy, because what happens is lenders lend excessively to people that they shouldn't be lending to. Those people who take on the loans default and the banks end up scratching their head. But in this case, the taxpayer will cover that difference. Now, some of you may remember, some of you may not, but we had a financial crisis in the early 2000s, which we refer to as the GFC, or the global financial crisis. Now, a major component of that GFC, of that global financial crisis, was caused by the housing market in the United States. And for those of you who do remember, it was based on a similar premise where home buyers were taking out mortgages that were backed by the government. And so the home buyer was able to use a much smaller deposit to get into that home, knowing that the government would back that loan, and the bank was happy to lend to that riskier mortgagee because they knew that the government, that the US government, would step in and secure that loan as well. So what happened when housing prices started to fall was the mortgagees weren't able to pay down their loan. And there were many instances of those homeowners who could no longer pay, who were just walking out and leaving their house vacant because the houses were, the mortgages turned upside down, meaning there was more to loan, there was more to repay on those loans than what the homes were actually worth. And because there was little incentive for the homeowner to actually stick around and keep that asset, they found a lot of them were just literally walking out and allowing the government to step in and pay the difference from what the home is now worth and what the bank was loaning out. We're seeing a similar setup here in Australia. Now, if the economy was looking really good, I would be a little less concerned, still concerned, but of a little less nature. However, just a few weeks ago, we literally recorded an economic forecast for Australia for the next 6 to 12 months. And all the indicators that we were looking at showed Money Media that the economy looks quite shaky and looks to be weakening, not strengthening. So what this sets up for me, what I'm looking at, is it sets up a banking institution that's already highly leveraged. It sets them up to be able to offer loans knowing that they're extremely low risk because the government will back them if they lose, no matter what. So we've been here before. We've seen this story. It's happened in the US about almost 25 years ago. Are we going to see the same thing again? Is this going to lead to another Australian-style GFC, AFC, let's call it, the Australian financial crisis? Only time will tell, so stick around with Money Media and we'll continually keep you updated to see where this takes us. And that's all for us for today. Thanks for sticking by.